Hello, everyone. I'm Sarah Barth, Executive Director of Semper Virens Fund. Thank you for joining us in another of our Under the Redwoods webinar series in which we explore all things redwood, ranging from the beauty and science of redwoods to the history, economics, benefits of redwoods, etc. We always start out with an acknowledgement of the fact that the redwood forests within which we do our conservation work were once the ancestral homes of indigenous people who were forcibly removed from the landscape, before which they cared for these lands quite effectively, and from which we have some things we could learn. And we are grateful to be working today with some of their descendants, including the Amamutsan tribal band and the Muwekma Ohlone, to help restore their cultural and traditional relationships to these amazing landscapes. We also begin by thanking Sharp Investments. They've been our longtime sponsor of the webinar, and we are grateful for their financial support for the Under the Redwoods webinar series. Many of you have been participating in these series previously, and so you know the drill, but just to remind you, or for those who haven't, we like to take questions from the audience. We try to get to as many of them as we can. You can use the chat tool or the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen to ask questions, and we'll try to cover as many as we can. And I also want to mention that we are recording the event and we'll be posting it on our website following, where you can watch it again and again if you wish. Since we last spoke with you, a lot has happened. One thing is we finally brought to conclusion successfully the purchase of the conservation easement that we've been working on for quite a while on the Camp Jones Gulch property, which is nearly 1,000 acres, and allowed us through that easement to protect the largest, what had been the largest unprotected stand of old growth redwoods in the Santa Cruz Mountains. So we feel really great about that. Many of you were involved in supporting that effort. And now we turn our attention to the development of a 10-year stewardship plan, and really beginning what will be, I think, a enduring commitment and partnership between Semper Virens Fund and the YMCA of San Francisco to steward that property and help restore some of the ecosystem health. So looking forward to that, and as we engage in projects on that property, we will be sure to share it with you. We also had a great end of year fundraising push. We raised nearly $1 million extra thanks to folks like you, and those funds will support us in our next phase of acquisition efforts that we're engaged with. We're on the cusp of purchasing some additional redwood properties for conservation. And of course, some of those funds will be used for stewarding the properties that we own. And that stewardship budget increased recently thanks to the amazing atmospheric rivers that we had this January. If you live in this region, or if you just read the news, you know we had an unprecedented amount of rain, 3 feet of water just in 1 month, which is more than we usually get in this region in a year. And as happened with the wildfires of a couple of years ago, we had a natural phenomena that had calamitous effects for the people of our region. And so our staff have been out in the field trying to assess the damage and the consequences, and to better understand what this kind of flooding and deluge mean for the landscape. We are ever learning, and it is a reminder that climate change continues to bring to us really new patterns of weather that we're going to need to adapt to as land managers and landowners. Interestingly, one of our field staff came back from a recent trip and mentioned that just water is seeping out of the sides of the mountains like tears, like the earth is weeping. And I thought, I don't know if those are tears of joy, given that the region has experienced 3 years of extreme drought, or whether they are bittersweet tears because too much water all at one time is tough. I'm not sure, but we have a lot to learn about these natural systems, and we will be sharing our learning with you, our audience, and our supporters. Today's speaker is somebody who can help us think about these things. Not that she has the answer to changing weather patterns per se, but she can help us understand how educators, can take what we learn and what we're experiencing in the Santa Cruz Mountains and bring it to the people in the communities that are in this landscape to better connect them to these landscapes, better facilitate an understanding of the natural world within which we live, and ideally help move those people from passive observation of the landscape to activist engagement in some of the policy and political decisions that affect the landscape and their own, how they shape their own lives. So with that, let me introduce our speaker. Felicia Van Stolk is the Executive Director of the Santa Cruz Museum of Natural History, based in Santa Cruz. She's a Santa Cruz native and has a background in environmental education and youth literacy. And she's been doing really exciting things with the museum. She leads their education team and their public programming. We'll put up their website, a link to their website at the end of the talk, but the museum is doing really innovative educational opportunities for community members who want to get out into the field and see some of these landscapes. In any case, so I really look forward to talking to her today and hearing from her about how the museum sees itself as a hub for the community, providing sort of connective tissue between the natural phenomena, the natural landscape, species, weather patterns, and the community of people who live in and among and experience that landscape. So with that, I invite Felicia to join us. Welcome, and we look forward to hearing your remarks.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you for inviting me to speak on this series. I'm excited to introduce you all to the Santa Cruz Museum of Natural History and what we do. So I'll share my screen now. And hopefully that's working for you. So here's a picture of the Museum of Natural History located in the historic Seabright neighborhood, right across from Seabright State Beach. Maybe some of you have been there. It's the one with the great big whale statue out. So as I mentioned, today I'll be sharing with you some of our history and a look at how our multidimensional approach to nature and science education can leverage our unique resources to inspire lifelong learning and environmental stewardship. But before I dive in there, I'd like to invite you to think about a time that you were out in nature and maybe saw something that baffled you or surprised you. Just think about just being out on a walk or along the shore and you just see something, just say, what is that? Maybe take a moment to describe it in the chat or in the Q&A, whichever is accessible to you. And think about how that felt. Think about what you did when you saw this nature mystery. Did you take a picture of it? Did you explore it? Did you pick it up? Or did you even take it home? Maybe ask somebody about it. We often find these things out in nature, and it can be this little spark. Lately, all things to do with mushrooms have been completely surprising and baffling me in a delightful way. Just like to start by thinking about not being in front of the computer and being out there inspired by nature. I'm not seeing anything coming in the chat, but feel free to reflect on a moment of surprise out in nature. All right, so before the museum came to its Seabright location, our origins started over 117 years ago in Santa Cruz's lighthouse, in the home of the first lighthouse keeper, Adna Heacock. Adna Heacock's daughter, Laura Heacock, as a young person, began to assemble a large collection of natural history specimens and other cultural artifacts. And I love to start the introduction of the museum here, because really our origin story is that of a curious child exploring the tide pools, which is a story that many of us can relate to. And you can actually see Laura Heacock here tide pooling in her Victorian era bustle. This innate spirit of inquiry is still very much at the heart of what we do today. So it's a great starting point. Laura Heacock eventually succeeded her father as the lighthouse keeper, and she set a bar for inclusivity that is carried on today. She actually welcomed people into her home and in the lighthouse and gave tours of her collection, which is pictured here. And she also shared cabinets of her collections with the California School for the Deaf. She continued to collect and became a well-known and respected naturalist, which was, of course, very unusual for women in this time. And she would correspond with scientists and trade specimens around the world. She was particularly well known for her seashell collection and even had several snails named after her. In addition to building the remarkable collection, Laura's innate curiosity drove her to explore all kinds of other things and areas not typically occupied by women, such as early photography, and some of her photos are also in our collection. Let's see. So at the museum, we view all of our students and visitors as the next generation of Laura Hecoxes. They each have the capacity to be curious and to leave a lasting impact. And so we carry on Laura's legacy of curiosity, inquiry, and community through our mission to connect people with nature and science to inspire stewardship of the natural world. And as you can see on this slide, curiosity and community appear multiple times. They are very central to what we do and how we accomplish our mission. We are constantly asking ourselves, what are people in our community going to be curious about? And it may not always be birds and mushrooms, although those are big hits. It can also be art, history, even Halloween. Everyone does have a nature connection. I really believe that. So it's up to us to tap into curiosity and find a pathway that helps people to grow that nature connection. And so now I'd like to dive a little bit deeper into how we are able to cultivate curiosity in an inclusive way, and a little bit about our educational philosophy as it applies to our exhibits, public programs, school field trips, and volunteer opportunities. And I'm going to get a little bit technical about how we go about fostering curiosity. I'm always excited when I get a captive audience to dive into this because I started as the museum's education director, and I have worked closely with the County Office of Education's Environmental Education Office to get this approach into classrooms. It's all about inquiry-based learning and the learning cycle, which we call the 5 E's. So the 5 E's are the steps of learning that we want our students, visitors, and participants to go through. The first E, it's actually the upper right. The first E is engaging interest and prior knowledge. Then we allow students to explore connections and relevant information. And a little note of clarification, this model is describing what the learner is doing. So next, this the student who explains their understanding. We do not explain to them. And they elaborate by connecting their understanding to other concepts or applications before self-evaluating what they've learned. So this is how we build our school programs, and it's also how we approach designing our exhibits and public programs. We focus on the learner going through the learning cycle rather than the instructor doing all the talking. And this student-led approach can be really joyful. Our students and our audience's curiosity is ultimately what is spinning this wheel of learning, and we can just go along for the ride. I should note that the museum collections are a uniquely amazing tool that supports this approach, especially our education collections, which we can view closely and even touch to explore. We can also tell different stories with our objects. Depending on how they're organized, described, or used, they can mean different things and tell different stories, which will ultimately resonate with different people. We also use this learning cycle through our public program. The picture on the upper right is one of my favorite traditions, our annual Halloween party and exhibit. So we've got a costume construction worker looking in our tide pool. Like I said, curiosity and engagement can come in many forms, and we love tapping into whatever it is that will get someone to linger and learn. One of our core values is that we celebrate many cultural connections to nature, And that can even include a fascination with the macabre. This Halloween party is always called the Museum of the Macabre. Now, because I have you here, I want to continue to get a little wonky and introduce another concept that is invaluable for environmental education. And that's the concept of an anchoring phenomenon. Anchoring phenomenon is simply something that you can observe that doesn't have an immediately apparent answer. It's something that you see and makes you go, huh? And that's what's anchoring our learning. So the phenomenon of phenomenon-driven learning is also not new, and it's something we're very likely familiar with. Pandemic, fire, storms, these are all phenomena. And we have seen that they all have fueled learning, exploration, and dialogue on huge scale. I don't know about you, but a few years ago, I became quite the epidemiologist. So when I asked the beginning of this talk about a nature mystery that has surprised you, what you were thinking about may have also been an anchoring phenomenon that drove your curiosity. Phenomenon-based learning is really powerful and fun because the motivation to solve the mystery lies within the student. This is also why nature-based learning is so potent. When immersed in nature or pondering a phenomenon, as educators, we can focus not only on interpretation and providing information, but on modeling and encouraging people to answer the questions in this diagram and to build that habit of asking questions when you see something that puzzles you. And what this looks like when it's really clicking and working is what we see in that bottom image. We have students deeply engaged in observation and conversation. Their wheels are turning without the intervention of a teacher, and they're developing their own understanding. Can you imagine if all of school was like that, where learning just looks like an excited group of people gathered around exclaiming over something and sharing their insights? I remember this day, and it was just such a delightful day out in the Redwoods at Pocono in Santa Cruz. So let's connect the dots here. I'd like to bring together anchoring phenomenon with our 5E learning cycle. So that anchoring phenomenon is the launching point that launches us into that first E of engage. And when we see a phenomenon, our initial questions are usually, what do you notice? What does it remind you of? These questions engage prior knowledge, and that also includes all kinds of knowledge, subject-specific, prior experience, but also social, emotional, and cultural knowledge shows up here as well. A really cool thing about this approach is that there are no wrong answers to what do you notice and what does it remind you of, which is where we start to really appreciate how natural history can be democratizing and inclusive. No matter what language you speak or what your educational background is, you have your senses, you have your curiosity, your own unique perspective, and then the natural phenomenon can be experienced by anyone. In fact, when we're learning in community, diversity strengthens investigation and learning because a diverse group can engage with more ways of understanding and more layers of prior knowledge. And that's one of the things I really love most about learning from nature at the museum. Our practices really highlight the benefits of inclusion and diversity to the shared learning experiences of a community. And we know that this type of approach can also maximize the positive impact of being outdoors for all. I'm sure many of us are familiar with, there are lots of studies that show that there are benefits from being outside to your health, your social and emotional well-being. There are also benefits to your health from social connection. All of that can be so good for you, which is also why as a trusted institution, we have a responsibility to make sure that everyone feels safe and valued in these spaces so that everyone can enjoy all of those rich benefits. And when we do that, we can also empower all kinds of people to see themselves as naturalists and to tap into their innate ability to study and to learn in nature. We can build skills, we can share the routines of inquiry and facilitate dialogue then we hand over the tools for lifelong learning to everyone. And that's how we move towards our vision of a wonderfully diverse community of naturalists. Pictured here are some of our naturalists in our community. We have a multi-generational group engaging with native plants through field sketching. In the upper right, we have a bunch of teens in our nature club who, I should point out, were some of the first people responsible for spotting and recording 2 rare birds in the area, the blue-footed booby and the Bonaparte gull. So if there are any birders in this group, you might have heard about the booby and the gull that were being sought after. This group of middle schoolers were among the first to report it. And then in the bottom right, we were talking about, you know, sacrificing our landscaping for the sake of learning. We have a kindergartner for our summer camp who was so inspired and enthralled that she was standing in our landscaping, looking at pollinators, about 15 minutes completely on her own. And if you have little kiddos in your life, you know that's a really long time for one of them to be just standing and enthralled in one place. In the past few years, we of our region have gone through some incredibly impactful phenomenon. And I think that our approach to empowering learning and also giving folks the tools and resources to explore, explain, and process with others has been an important way that we've shown up to support our community. Pictured on the left is a group of museum volunteers visiting Bonnie Doon shortly after the CZU fires through our CZU and U program. Through this program, folks are guided through burned areas where they can observe the impacts and learn about fire ecology. Then they are also trained to take biodiversity data that will build an understanding of fire impacts for our local region. And they hear directly from land managers about the importance of monitoring recovery. And we've been doing this for the last 2 years now. And on the right is another project that came from the same time. It was an amazing opportunity. This project was an amazing opportunity to learn, heal, and connect after a very tumultuous year. 2020 Vision started as an exhibit made entirely of community-submitted photography and writing. It became this outlet for people to express how the natural phenomena of 2020 impacted their lives, and to consider how deeply rooted in nature our human communities are. This exhibit actually eventually became a book, which then benefited Fire Relief Fund. These projects in particular highlight how important action is in the cycle of learning and connecting that we cultivate here at the museum. Which brings me to stewardship. Curiosity and community are central to our vision and values, but the key piece, the final piece of our mission is to inspire stewardship of the natural world. So just as we celebrate many ways of connecting with nature, we also honor and acknowledge that there are many pathways to action and stewardship. Probably most of us are familiar with the classic paradigm of love it, protect it. Sometimes it's presented as love it, learn about it, protect it. And in that model, stewardship action is the elaborate or evaluate part of our learning cycle. For example, I love the ocean. I learned about how watersheds connect my mountain home to the ocean. So I know that by fixing my septic tank leak, I can protect ocean health. This is a very valuable pathway to stewardship and one that can really last a lifetime. That's the classic, love it, protect it. But we also acknowledge that there are many, many other motivations for people to become stewards. Some people are motivated by the safety of their own community. Stewardship isn't always altruism, it's survival. There's also social connection and community building, which we see a lot amongst our native plant gardening group, many of whom signed up just to meet new people. There's also social capital or social pressure, like getting school credit or being able to post a picture of your good deeds on social media, or even getting some perk through your job. These are all very valid ways to become stewards and students of nature. And then, of course, many people volunteer as a way to learn, like our community science volunteers who wanted to learn more about fire ecology. So to inspire lifelong learning and stewardship for people of all backgrounds, we have to find relevance that speaks to many motivations. We also keep in mind that no matter what the motivation, research shows that lifelong pro-environmental behavior is best fostered through engaging with locally relevant topics that are actionable. Think global, act local, right? It's also essential that a person feels like they have some agency and efficacy, that they have the skills and ability to make a real difference. Absent any of these pieces, and eventually motivation is going to run dry. And this is why the museum has such a diverse approach to our mission. We activate community building, we're centered around curiosity, we celebrate multiple ways for connecting, and we also focus on skill building and recurring engagement. By emphasizing that anyone can be a naturalist and anyone can have the agency and efficacy to make meaningful change, and by valuing the many ways of connecting and taking action, we have broadened the definition of what it means to be an environmentalist. And looking at the challenges we have ahead, inclusivity in environmentalism, the protection of nature is essential. And it's why I am so proud of what the museum is able to do. So I really thank you for letting me share that vision with you and get a little technical about that educational piece. And I really hope that you'll join me at the museum or out in nature sometime soon. And with that, maybe I'll stop my sharing.
Thanks, Felicia. That was really interesting. And I'm reflecting on the fact that, you know, I grew up going to the American Natural History Museum in New York and the Smithsonian in DC, these sort of classic taxidermy, diorama-filled museums that were based on collections like the one you showed at the beginning of your remarks. And they've obviously changed since then, and I've gone to them since then and seen how they've adapted. But one of the things that's so striking in your talk is that you didn't include any contemporary pictures really of the collection. It was mostly kids and people in the outdoors, which I find so interesting and really strongly indicates the kind of learning that you're encouraging. So it's really neat to see, and it makes sense. I mean, we have similar feedback from our supporters that getting out into the landscape, experiencing it, learning about it directly is much more effective. I am curious, you talked a lot about inclusivity. That's something that this audience has thought about and heard about in different contexts. And I wonder, how do you get people into the museum or connected to your programs, aware of your programs to begin with, understanding that once they're there, the approach you used, and as you explained, is in part about helping everybody experience it in their own way. But how do you reach different communities to begin with to ensure that people are across a wide spectrum of backgrounds and experiences know about what the museum has to offer and about what the natural landscape around them has to offer?
That's a great question, and it's always something that we're trying to solve and do even better. You know, that work is never done. We're very lucky that many people's first introduction to the museum is through school program. We serve students from across the county, and we've made tremendous efforts to reduce barriers. So all of our school programs are free, and we're also working on offering transportation scholarships to as many schools as possible. And that's a great entry point. You know, as I mentioned, we work with teachers as well. So, so even if they can't come to us, we're often going to them, or even doing virtual programming, or sending kits of educational specimens to the classroom. Is a great starting point. We also do quite a lot of outreach. We have something called the Mobile Museum, which is nothing fancy. It's really just a box of stuff. But we make an effort to go and show up where people are. You know, farmers markets, community events, all kinds of ways to just be out there and be there for people as a way of introduction. yeah, I think the mobile museum point is funny because, you know, you're right. I didn't put a lot of pictures of our exhibits, our collections, but really the museum and the collections, the place and the things, it's just a building full of old stuff
Right.
without the people. And it's really the people, the students, the staff, those connections that make it a vibrant place for learning.
Yeah, yeah.
So whether or not it's that mobile box or it's the museum itself, it's how we are building those connections that is what the museum is in my heart.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned that you have, you try to have different approaches that are culturally relevant, and you mentioned the Halloween event. Are there other things like that where you try to connect with particular communities through things or practices or ceremonies that are important to them that you could share with us?
Yeah, I mean, we approach natural history through many, many lenses. There's the Halloween event is a great example, but we also have a long tradition of connecting with the art and through the art. So in the spring, we'll have our 34th annual Science Illustration exhibits, and there are always lots of programming opportunities around that, field sketching, sometimes even poetry. Again, all of these ways of building an emotional connection with nature are super important. And we also definitely value connecting with, you know, cultural connections and especially indigenous cultural connections through our work with schools and also with our exhibit, which we have recently rewritten with a lot of input from the Amamutsan tribal bands.
Yeah, with whom we partner as well. And we are exploring actively with you a project that we would like to be supportive of around developing some interpretive materials, panels and whatnot at the Chitoni Coast Areas unit of the California Coastal National Monument. And I wondered if you could share with this audience what's the role that the museum is playing in that? Because I'm not sure people might immediately think of a museum as a place where you would develop signage for a public land place that the public can visit. And I know you are involving the Amamutsan and other partners. And I wondered if you could tell people about that, because I think it's a really innovative approach and also just revealing about what the museum, how the museum sees itself in the community.
Thank you. Yes, we are excited to be entering this space. I know that the management of this new monument has been a long and ongoing story, and we're the new kids on the block. But we are really excited to come into this with a fresh perspective and with the relationships that we can bring to this project. So the first and most important step to us as we think about how do we interpret this landscape, which is what we're doing all the time, is to have lots of conversations with the people who have been spending the time on that land. So that includes the Amamutsan tribal band, neighbors. There's a national Leave No Trace program, ecologists, geologists, archaeologists. Lots of people have been working with this special property. And so through hours and hours of conversation, we're starting to understand each of those perspectives, and we're finding those sparks of engagement that are really important to each of those different audiences. And there's just so much common ground.
Yeah.
From people who are there, they're all loving the same things, and we get to draw that out and make that little nugget of curiosity that will spark those wheels turning about people wanting to engage and learn. And it's also an opportunity to kind of set up the property, visitors, neighbors, set everybody up for success.
Yeah.
You know, if they're coming into it with a certain mindset, that can really be influenced by what sign greets them.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that really just fits in with the museum being an interpreter, you know, being out there in the natural world for our community. And we're also starting to work on interpretive signs for some city properties as well, because they're acknowledging that we're out there talking to people about these landscapes already.
Yeah, well, I find it so interesting. You know, we are involved in a lot of interpretive signs. We fund a lot of that kind of effort because we want people to get out and understand and appreciate landscapes and see themselves represented in some of the stories that are told. But typically it's, you know, a set of experts in forest ecology or in tribal history who sit in a room, write up some text, different people review it, they get some pictures, and then this panel gets created. And this is being generated so differently. It's starting with conversation and with community members, and not just a set of experts, or as a tribal chairman Lopez likes to say, the ologists. You're really going to a broader array of people with connections and expertise. So we're really eager to see the upshot of that project. And I've heard you say, and you may have even said it in this session, that the museum can be the connective tissue between sort of the natural world and the community. And that seems like an illustration of that.
Yeah, that's right. I think, and that's really common in the museum world of doing testing and prototyping, we call it, and really making sure that what the intent is ringing through. So often the ologists kind of get lost in their terminology and they want everybody to know everything. But from the museum experience, from this perspective of constantly thinking about how do I get a huge audience to take away just one nugget is all we can do, and really distilling it down to something that's super accessible and still very effective. I hope that this more museum style approach to creating interpretation will have really effective outcomes and include all of those different perspectives. Yeah, that's what we do.
Well, it may also, I suspect it will, and I think it also may invite more community members in to visit this place who may not otherwise have seen it as something that is theirs. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens. I'm curious, you know, I talked at the opening a little bit, and you talked about some of the work you've done with the fires, and I mentioned the flooding, and this region has been just hammered by natural phenomena that, you know, it's not like it's new to the region to have wildfire, but the extremes, and same with the flooding, particularly after years of drought. It's just been, nature has been just front and center in its impact in people's lives in recent years in this region and elsewhere in the Western United States. And I'm curious whether you have seen that that makes people more interested in what's going on with nature, more connected, or are they more fearful? Or, yeah, how are you seeing the fact that nature is dramatically in the face of everybody in these communities? How are you seeing that play out in terms of people's interest in learning more or understanding more? Has it heightened it, or, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's really hard to see all the heartache and damage caused by everything. I was just going to say the storms, but as you mentioned, there've just been massive natural phenomena after phenomena. You know, we could do our 2020 vision book all over again, and that was just 1 year's worth of phenomena.
About water. Yeah.
So, you know, it's hard to see all of that, but it really is a unique opportunity to engage people. And I think we're definitely seeing folks tuning in and wanting to understand, if for no other reason than they want to know what's coming up next and how to prepare for it. And it's, you know, it's part of, for many people, especially after fires, we saw that it's very healing to process, you know, folks who have lost a home or lost a loved one to something. Being able to be out in nature just is healing. And then to further that with some understanding, and, you know, nature isn't demonized. Oh, this is a process. Oh, like, wow, this is just, nature's doing its thing. And it's also an opportunity to kind of help us realize our place in that, in all of that. And then the museum itself has a really unique position, having stood witness to similar events going back over 120 or 115 years. You know, so we have collections that demonstrate many, many natural phenomenon, earthquakes, fires going back. So these collections demonstrate a really long history of humans battling with nature. And this allows us to contextualize a little bit of what people are experiencing right now, and hopefully inspire people to learn from past mistakes a little bit. So it's again, like historic images and things like that are an entry point. People are, you know, maybe it's a little raw to think about today's damage, but like, whoa, these horse-drawn carriages are bumping over broken roads. So it's a little bit, it's in some cases an easier way to approach the conversation. Well,
I want to probe on one last area, and then I'll turn it over to my colleague to see what kind of questions we may have gotten from our audience. But you mentioned this, and it always is intriguing to me, and that is the issue of turning learning into activism, which of course is of great interest to organizations like Semper Virens Fund, because that's what we're keen to see, is people who then become not only interested in going into careers in conservation, but who will stand up and be a voice in the political and policy arena or in the media on behalf of nature and nature conservation. And I know much earlier in my career, we would partner with institutions like the museum, and they would be very skittish about doing anything that smacked of activism. It felt too political, too dangerous, I think, frankly, that somehow they'd be stepping into something very polarized. And for a long time, people in the museum and the zoo community didn't even want to talk about things like climate change because it was so divisive, perceived as risky and divisive. I get the sense from you that you don't see it that way, and that you do see your role as one of encouraging not only understanding, but also sort of nudging people in that direction toward activism. And I just wondered if you could say a bit more about that, how you as the museum director think about it, what you think the role is of the museum in encouraging the public to engage in sort of the larger decision-making that goes on around some of these conservation issues.
Well, you're right that climate change and biodiversity loss, habitat loss, those aren't controversies. That's settled scientific fact. And we're a science museum, so there's no problem talking about that and helping people to understand that. And I really feel like as an educational institution, especially one with a long history within our community, people trust us to tell them the truth and to present things in a way that's non-judgmental, that's, embracing the multiple perspectives, your perspectives, but is rooted in fact and science, and empowering people to learn on their own, that giving the people the tools to think critically is so much more important to me than giving them a long list of facts. And I really think that's the foundation for an active and engaged community and citizenry. And we don't tell people how to vote or what to support, but we lay out kind of these are the facts. This is how you can make this decision with your own eyes, with your own senses. And, when things are happening, like our coast is being eroded away, we can say, hey, look, our partners at the city have this climate resilience plan. Oh, look, a living shoreline. Look at how this beach did compared to that beach. And it doesn't have to be political at all. It's completely, it's non-controversial, and people try to get us broiled in, and, we can just say, look at the facts right here. We can look with our own eyes and understand how we are connected. And honestly, the extremeness of what's been going on really lays bare.
Yeah,
These
literally.
we are connected.
Beaches.
Yes, we are connected, and there's nothing political about that.
Yeah, I lied. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'll turn it over to my colleague. I'm grateful that you view it that way, and that makes complete sense to me. And this is more just sort of I realize you probably don't have data on this, but I'm curious anecdotally, to me, watching the conservation field, and particularly in the sort of policy arena, I've been amazed to see in recent years the engagement of youth in a much more active way than, say, when I was younger. And, there are some really prominent people, but it's not just prominent people. I feel like you see it at the high school, college level, kids, youth. I guess if you're in high school, you're not a kid per se, but younger people way more willing to be active on behalf of the environment. And I wonder if you see the same thing, because that gives me a great deal of hope that there's understanding, and not just understanding, but a willingness to say things need to change, and here's how change needs to happen. And I just was curious, since you interact with so many younger people, if you are feeling similar hope.
Absolutely. I don't even know where it comes from, but this uprising generation of folks just seems really empathetic and connected in a way that it is really hopeful. And we have, especially in Santa Cruz area, so many really active and activist students who are doing things. And you also have to give credit to tremendous teachers and wonderful resources. The Santa Cruz County Office of Education is unique in that they have a whole office for environmental education. Yeah. And so, which is amazing. We're here at the forefront for environmental education nationwide, worldwide. And so the students have a lot of community support, and that's just great because those early successes just really fuel a life, a whole lifetime of being engaged. So yeah, we see it at the local level, and I know that, every level up, people do read letters, people do care about public comment. And I think the more folks see that, and the earlier students are given those opportunities to speak at a city council meeting or whatever it is, the better, because, it's empowering and it feels so good to be listened to. And I'm so glad that people are listening to kids more.
Yeah, well, those are the future leaders or existing leaders, I guess, as well. All right, well, let me turn it over to my colleague, Matt Schaefer, to see if he has questions that have come in over the chat or the Q&A that he wants to ask you to help answer.
I do. And Felicia, thank you so much for taking time with our audience today. One of our questions is about the museum's collaborations with local tribes, and wondering if you talk more about how those come together. And I'll add, what are the challenges for museums and educators that they need to consider and overcome in collaborating with tribes?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Working with the Amamutsan Tribal Band was one of the very first things I took on when I joined the museum as the education director. So that started 7 years ago, rewriting our First Peoples program. The museum is one of a handful, maybe only 2 organizations that does interpretation about Indigenous culture, the other being the mission. And so it was really important to me that we update that and make sure that the tribe's contemporary culture and values were being represented. So through that process of completely rewriting our First Peoples program, which is a 40-year-old school field trip that many students, including myself, went to. Through that process, we really started to develop this beautiful relationship, understanding the priorities of the tribe, and just building in this dialogue that's just sort of ongoing forever. And then next we tackled reinterpreting our First Peoples room. We have an exhibit in the museum, and really wanting to make sure that we contextualized it and made it make sense for a natural history museum. Why does a natural history museum talk about Indigenous culture? And what it is that, you know, just there's lots of history behind that, but what it is now is talking about many cultural connections to nature. And this cultural connection to nature is ongoing. It is the original culture on this land. And so in that way, we're celebrating not just a piece of history, but really a part of the landscape. And we also continue to work with the tribe on public walks, public engagement, and an annual teacher training, which is huge. So you asked about the challenges for teachers. Quite often, especially for elementary school teachers, is finding good resources, having primary sources first for students to look at, not just the history textbooks that were written however long ago. And so our annual Amamutsin Educator Workshop puts teachers in the same room as tribal representatives and let them hear it, you know, for themselves, let them have those conversations and ask the delicate questions like, what's the right terminology? How can I do this without scaring my students? You know, what do you teach your own youth within the tribal community? And that's those questions that we hear all the time. Those are the challenges, is really wanting to do right, but not having the resources. And of course, the tribal bands also don't have resources to go do these things. So disseminating that, finding trusted partners to carry on the messages that they value, and also just frankly getting the funding and support that they need to travel over here, to spend a day talking to teachers, to reviewing the curriculum. It's all, you know, really important to continue to invest in that.
Thank you. That's terrific, and that's an amazing workshop. I'm thrilled that that's a resource that you're organizing. I want to switch gears. As not surprisingly, we talk a lot about redwoods, and we've talked a lot in the last couple of years about redwoods and fire. So this question is, what is the most interesting thing that you have seen or learned about redwoods since and fire since the fire?
You know, I think one of the most amazing things, it's not new, but just the resilience of these trees and how they've come back in so many areas. The museum leads very regular walks to the Fall Creek burn zone in collaboration with the California State Parks. And it's called Fall Creek After Fire, and that's a series that you might be interested in joining. It's just really amazing to see what comes up and to see even like rare mushrooms. Our group, you know, was involved in kind of finding these fire followers. I think the ecology of a redwood forest, that's obviously supported and rooted by these amazing trees, is just absolutely fascinating. And so seeing the growth patterns, the understory, how the understory is responding, it's just amazing. And that's the benefit. And I would encourage any of you, if you've got your special spot, keep going to that special spot over and over and over again and pay really close attention, because those areas that were burned are just doing some really interesting things.
Thank you. You have a lot of, you just mentioned the Fall Creek program. You have a lot of programs and events, both at the museum and outside in the world. Do you have a favorite program, recurring or upcoming, that you want to make sure that folks know about, that they may not be aware of, and that they should definitely attend?
Yeah, I definitely think the Fall Creek After Fire series is worth jumping on. They always fill. I think we don't have any next month, but the following month we'll pick it back up. It's just great, and you can go over and over and over again and see something different. And then in the spring is one of my favorites. We always have our science illustration show, which I mentioned, The Art of Nature. It's a big hit. It's beautiful. And having all these artists around interpreting the world for you, you just see things in a different light. And so I always love to go on a nature journaling walk led by one of our artists, because the way an artist views you know, we don't walk very far. We never get very far because we're constantly stopping and being excited about something. The way an artist views the same path that I've walked down a million times it's just a wonderful, refreshing way to approach going on a hike. So that will be up in mid-March, and we'll have programming throughout the spring.
Amazing, thank you. I know that your fungi tours are sold out. Yes. We did get a question about mushrooms, so I wanted to ask. Someone's interested in the types of mushrooms that present post-fire in the redwood forest, and I was wondering if you could talk about any particular kinds that are only present under those circumstances.
You know, I will just have to say I am sorry, I don't know. That is not my area of expertise, but I'm trying to think if we have a talk about it. I think we do have a talk recorded on our website about fire followers. If not, I can maybe follow up and connect you guys to the resources, because there was, in fact, a fire follower mushroom that came up in the burn zone, discovered by, or described and identified by Christian Schwartz, who's a local mycologist and friend of the museum. So yeah, I'm not going to make up an answer and just say we'll connect you with those resources.
Always a great choice for an educator, not to make up an answer, but we'll share a link to the watch the past events link for you. Here's a question about your connections in the community. It feels like you're connected to just about everybody. What does it mean to be at the center of such a vibrant learning community? And what are some of the limitations?
Well, it is somewhat dizzying sometimes, to be honest, but it feels great because, you know, it's been a long process to reestablish ourselves. You know, the museum has been around for a very long time, but I would say just in the last few years, we've really made such an effort to reach out and to build those connections so that people see us again as a hub for learning. And, you know, now the limitation is we can't say yes to everyone, and we just really want to. We want to bring people in. We want to reach out, and we also want to do so in a way that's thoughtful and productive. So we try not to overextend ourselves. And we're really just trying to focus on how to do that in a way that increases our diversity and the diversity of the impact that we have as we move forward. Because there are just so many resources. We're in a really resource-rich community, which is a good problem to have.
Well, on that note, Felicia, I want to thank you. And I know that we're interested in expanding our partnership with you. So we'll be in the queue. And for those of you who don't know, Sempervirens has a very big anniversary coming up in 2025. And so we've started to explore with the museum how we can take advantage of that educational opportunity. So that's a longer term project, and we're excited to partner with you in the more immediate on a variety of things. But thank you so much for joining us and for just your role in the community. It's really remarkable, and we're fortunate to have you in the museum playing that role. And for those of you who have questions about fungal fire followers, it just so happens that our next speaker is a mycologist. Dr. Patty Onaniwu-Kashian is going to be coming to speak, and she's not actually coming to speak exclusively about fungi, but I'm sure we could ask her the fire following question. So you're off the hook in that regard. And what she will be speaking about, though, is a very different topic, which is the history of the conservation movement and some of the troubling social dynamics at the time that the conservation movement was emerging, and how that has manifested in contemporary times with disconnect between certain communities that were, what's the word I want? That were denigrated or ostracized at the time, and the lasting impacts that has had. So it'll be a very interesting conversation, And in the meantime, check out the museum for talks and walks and learning opportunities. And thank you again to Scharf Investments for sponsoring us in this webinar series. And thanks to our audience for being interested in these topics and for being so supportive of Sempervirens. So we will see you again next month. And thanks again, Felicia.